The blizzard didn't just steal the road, it stole mercy. For Clara Monroe, a widow with nothing left but her 3 shivering children, hope had frozen long before the snow buried the plains. Night was falling. Their wagon was gone. Their strength was fading. And when her knees finally buckled and her arms gave out, she thought it was the end. But death didn't come. Instead, footsteps did. Heavy, steady, reluctant. He was the last man anyone would pray for in a moment like this. Colt Mercer, a name whispered in saloons and nailed on wanted posters. An outlaw, a ghost from a bloody past who had vanished deep into the wild, where regrets froze harder than rivers. Yet on that night, as the storm clawed at their souls, it was Colt who carried them inside. It was Colt who lit the fire. And it was Colt who, despite the steel in his eyes and the scars on his hands, offered them the only thing colder men had denied for years, a second chance. What began as reluctant shelter grew into something more. As days passed and the snow softened, so did the walls between them. Laughter returned. Trust was rebuilt, board by board, like the old cabin creaking back to life. And when the blizzard finally released its hold on the land, something far stronger remained in that cabin. A broken man, a shattered woman, and 3 children who no longer cried themselves to sleep. A family forged not by blood, but by survival, kindness, and the courage to stay when leaving was easier. The wind came in waves that felt like fists. It screamed through the dark forest, bending trees and bearing every whisper of a road beneath thick, merciless snow. No one sane would be outside, and yet she was. Clara Monroe tightened her grip on the thin wool blanket clinging to her shoulders. Beside her, the children shuffled with stiff legs and burning lungs, too cold now even to cry. "Almost there," Clara whispered, though there was no truth in her words. She hadn't seen a sign of shelter for hours. Not since the wagon lost its wheel and darkness fell like a shroud. Her son Matthew, just 8, held his sister Lila's hand tightly. Lila, barely 5, had stopped asking questions an hour ago. That scared Clara more than the snow. Children should ask. They should cry. But survival had stolen even that. Clara's boots sank deep with each step. The storm had a hunger of its own, swallowing their tracks before they'd taken 2 paces. She couldn't feel her fingers anymore. Her legs threatened to betray her. Still, she pressed on. She had no choice. Until she couldn't. Clara fell forward into the snow, her arms automatically wrapping around Lila as she hit the ground. Matthew cried out. The storm roared louder, as if mocking them. This is it, Clara thought, panic tightening her throat. She tried to rise, but the world spun. Her lips cracked when she spoke. "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry." And then, light. A faint orange glow cut through the raging white. Lantern light, and footsteps, heavy, unhurried. Clara squinted against the blinding snow. A shadow approached, large and broad-shouldered, moving like a ghost carved from the storm itself. He stopped a few paces away, his face half hidden beneath the brim of a battered cowboy hat. His voice, when it came, was low and rough as gravel. "What the hell are you doing out here?" Clara couldn't answer. She could barely form words. Instead, she huddled closer to the children. Fear gripped her harder than the cold. She'd heard stories. Outlaws, drifters, men who lived by no law but their own. "Please," she managed, her voice cracking. "They're my children." The man crouched slowly, lantern held high to inspect them. His eyes, sharp and calculating, swept over the group. His face said he didn't want this, didn't want them. But when his gaze settled on Lila, half buried in snow and trembling uncontrollably, something shifted. Without another word, he stood and tossed his long, heavy coat over Clara and the children in one motion. "Get up," he ordered. "You're coming with me. You freeze out here, you're dead." Clara hesitated, but there was no other option. No road, no moon, no hope but him. They followed, shuffling behind as he cut a path through knee-deep snow. Not once did he offer comfort. Not once did he slow, but he never left them behind. When they reached the cabin, Clara almost cried. A squat, log-built home, barely visible through the blizzard, yet glowing faintly with firelight. The man kicked the door open and gestured them inside. Clara carried Lila in, Matthew stumbling behind. Inside it was warmer, barely, but enough to thaw the fear clinging to her bones. The stranger hung his lantern, stripped off his gloves, and knelt by the fire to stir it higher. Clara clutched her children on the rough wool rug, her teeth chattering. He didn't ask names, didn't offer his. He simply said, "Storm won't let up till morning. You'll stay. Just don't touch anything." Clara studied him as he worked. Rough hands, weathered face, eyes that had seen too much. Not kindness, not cruelty, just tired. The outlaw. She was sure of it now. Men didn't hide this deep in the woods without a reason. Still, when he pushed a tin cup of something warm toward her, Clara accepted it. She didn't trust him, but trust was a luxury. Tonight, they owed him everything. And as the blizzard howled like a living thing beyond those walls, Clara Monroe realized something she hadn't dared think since the day her husband died. They might survive this, but what came after survival? That was a question for tomorrow. The storm slammed against the cabin like an angry god, rattling the shutters and howling through the cracks in the old logs. Inside, the silence between them pressed heavier than the wind. Clara sat close to the hearth, legs curled beneath her as she held Lila against her chest. The little girl's cheeks were pink now, not from cold, but from the slow return of warmth. Matthew and his younger brother Jesse sat nearby, trading glances between their mother and the stranger. He sat alone at the rough-hewn table, one hand wrapped around a tin cup, the other slowly turning a hunting knife over and over in his palm. Not threatening, not exactly, but a reminder, Clara thought, that this man wasn't used to sharing his space. She cleared her throat gently. "Thank you for helping us." The stranger didn't look up. His eyes stayed fixed on the blade. "Didn't do it for thanks." His voice was rough, not cruel, just blunt, like the words had to be carved before they were spoken. Clara hesitated. "My name's Clara Monroe. These are my children, Matthew, Jesse, and the little one's Lila." The man didn't answer right away. Then softly, as if saying it aloud cost him something, "Colt Mercer." Clara's breath caught. She knew that name. Everyone west of the Platte River knew that name. Colt Mercer, bank robber, gunman, the outlaw who rode with the Hollow Ridge Gang years ago before they vanished into dust and legend. Her instinct screamed at her to gather her children and flee into the night. Storm or not. But reality held her tight. Out there was death. In here, so far, was only caution. Colt noticed the way her eyes shifted, the way her fingers tightened around her daughter. He sighed heavily and leaned back in his chair. "I ain't that man no more," he said quietly. "Been years since I rode. Years since anyone gave a damn whether I lived or froze." Clara didn't know what to say. The children didn't seem to care. Matthew, emboldened by warmth and curiosity, broke the heavy silence. "Did you really rob trains?" Colt chuckled. Not kindly, but not harsh either. "Not trains, banks mostly. Trains were too fast and too loud." Matthew's eyes went wide, but Clara shot him a sharp look. "That's not polite," she scolded gently. Colt waved it off. "Boy's curious. Ain't a crime." The knife stopped turning. Colt set it down and stood, stretching his broad shoulders. "I'll get you more blankets," he said gruffly, disappearing into the back room. When he returned, he tossed 2 thick wool throws onto Clara's lap. "Fire dies in the middle of the night. Wrap up tight." "Thank you," Clara whispered again. He shrugged, busying himself with stirring the fire. Later, when the children fell asleep, bundled together like puppies, Clara found herself alone in the flickering glow of the hearth with the outlaw. "You live here alone?" she asked softly. Colt didn't look away from the flames. "Since I put my gun down." "Why?" The question hung heavy in the warm air. Colt's jaw tightened. His voice dropped lower, barely audible above the crackle of burning wood. "Too many ghosts." Clara understood. She had her own ghosts. A husband buried in frozen earth 2 counties east. A life left behind in ashes and regret. Neither spoke after that. Words weren't needed. Instead, she watched Colt as he leaned back in his chair, eyes heavy but never truly relaxed. He guarded himself even in sleep, like a man who knew danger didn't knock before entering. Clara stayed awake long after the embers dimmed, watching him, watching the children, listening to the storm. Outside, the blizzard raged. Inside, something else stirred. Not trust, not yet, but the brittle, fragile roots of it. She didn't know who Colt Mercer truly was, but tonight none of them were who they used to be. They were just survivors, sharing borrowed warmth, waiting for morning. Morning didn't come quietly. It broke in sudden flashes of blue light and groaning trees bowing under mountains of snow. The blizzard had not yet spent its fury. Still, within the cabin, it felt softer. Colt was already awake when Clara stirred. He sat by the window, sharpening his knife absently, eyes watching the storm without really seeing it. The children slept late, worn thin from fear and exhaustion. Lila clung to Clara's side, her small face tucked beneath her mother's arm. Matthew and Jesse were tangled together beneath the heavy quilts Colt had given them. Clara moved carefully, not to wake them, as she crossed to the stove. "I can make something," she offered quietly. Colt didn't argue. Instead, he shifted to give her room. There was nothing grand in the pantry, just beans, dried meat, and a few root vegetables shriveled from the cold. Still, Clara worked. Her hands needed something to do. So did her mind. While the pot simmered, Colt finally spoke. "You're good with them," he said simply. Clara paused, surprised by the softness in his voice. "They're mine. That's what mothers do." Colt's mouth tightened slightly. He said nothing more. By the time the children woke, breakfast was ready, simple but hot. They ate eagerly, murmuring small thank yous that made Colt uncomfortable enough to mutter about manners and focus on his coffee. As the morning wore on, the storm seemed to hesitate, not ending, but losing its edge. The children grew restless. Colt found Matthew watching him as he cleaned his rifle near the door. "Is that loaded?" the boy asked. Colt raised an eyebrow. "Wouldn't be much use if it wasn't." Matthew stepped closer, fearless in the innocent way only boys could be. "Did you shoot bad men with it?" Clara stiffened, but Colt only exhaled slowly. Sometimes they weren't bad enough. Sometimes I was worse." Silence hung for a moment. Then Matthew surprised them both. "But you're not bad now." Colt looked up sharply, meeting the boy's earnest eyes. Something in him cracked. So small, so buried, Clara almost missed it. "No, kid," Colt said quietly. "Not anymore." Later, as the children played with carved wood scraps near the fire, Clara and Colt shared quiet company. He worked on reshaping an old block of pine into something small and delicate. Clara watched his hands. Rough, scarred, yet steady. Not a killer's hands anymore, a craftsman's hands. "You didn't have to help us," she said softly. Colt's jaw tensed. "Didn't plan to." "Then why did you?" His knife paused. For a long time he didn't speak. Finally, voice low and heavy with memory, he answered. "Years back, my brother's wife and kids tried to find him. Wrong trail, wrong time. Blizzard like this hit him. They didn't make it." Clara's heart ached at the words. "And you couldn't save them." "I wasn't there," he said flatly. "I should have been." There it was, the ghost in his eyes, not the blood on his hands, the ones he couldn't save. Clara swallowed the lump rising in her throat. "That wasn't your fault." Colt gave a humorless smile. Guilt doesn't care much about fault. The day passed slowly. The storm outside faded into a steady hush, soft but unrelenting. Inside, however, warmth grew in subtle ways. Matthew and Jesse tugged Colt outside before dusk to show him how they'd made snowmen behind the cabin. Lila shyly offered him her dolly to hold while she adjusted its tiny scarf. Colt, surprisingly, obliged without mockery. Clara watched from the doorway, arms crossed but lips tilted into the faintest smile. When they returned inside, cheeks red from cold and laughter, Colt caught Clara's gaze. She held it longer this time. For the first time since her husband's death, Clara Monroe didn't feel invisible, didn't feel broken. Colt's walls were still high, but they weren't impenetrable anymore. And as the night fell once more, and the wind whispered promises of clearer skies soon, Clara wondered something dangerous. What happens when survival turns to belonging? She wasn't sure of the answer yet, but as Colt carefully tucked the children in by the hearth without anyone asking him to, She knew this wasn't the man who once rode with killers. Not anymore. By morning, the storm had given up. No more screaming wind, no more furious snow slamming against the old cabin walls. Just quiet, heavy, unfamiliar quiet. Colt stood in the doorway, surveying the world reborn in white. The sun hadn't yet broken through, but a faint blue glow stretched across the land, like a breath long held and finally released. Clara stepped up beside him, pulling her shawl tight. "It's over," she said softly. Colt gave a short nod. "Storm's over," he agreed. "Doesn't mean it's safe." Clara studied his face. The hard edges were still there, lines carved deep by years of regret and solitude. But something had changed in him. Less guarded now, less resigned. Behind them, the children were already moving about, full of restless energy. Jesse and Matthew were stacking firewood in clumsy towers, while Lila sat by the hearth drawing shapes in the soot with a stick. Clara watched them a moment, then turned back to Colt. "You don't have to keep acting like you don't care," she said quietly. Colt stiffened slightly. "They're good kids," he said finally. "Better off when this is over." Clara frowned, not liking the way he said that. "What do you mean?" Colt glanced at her, eyes sharper now. "You think you're the first folks who needed a roof in a storm? You're not. You'll move on when the snow melts. Go back to whatever life waits down the road." "And you won't?" Colt's jaw tightened. "I don't go back." Clara hesitated before asking what she knew was a loaded question. "Why not?" Colt stepped outside, crunching snow beneath his boots as he leaned against the porch rail. "Last time I tried," he said slowly, "men like me weren't welcome. Too many folks remembering the past, too many whispers. You don't get to erase what's been written in blood." Clara followed, standing a few feet from him. Her breath steamed in the cold as she spoke gently. "But people change." Colt gave a bitter smile. "Maybe, but towns don't." They stood in silence for a while, watching as the children tumbled into the snowbanks and laughed, free at last from fear and hunger. "They like you, you know," Clara said softly. Colt shook his head, but there was no venom in it. "Kids don't know better." Clara stepped closer, her voice firmer now. "Number kids know exactly what's good for them. They know who protects them, who looks after them. They know you." The words hit harder than Clara expected. Colt turned to face her fully, his face unreadable, but his eyes. They betrayed something, something raw, something hopeful and terrified. "You don't understand," he murmured. "Men like me don't get to have soft endings." Clara's expression softened. "Maybe you don't get to choose how you started, Colt. But you sure as hell can choose what comes next." Before he could respond, the door behind them creaked open. Lila poked her head out, face bright and innocent. "Mr. Colt, we made room for you, by the fire. You can sit with us." Colt stared at her, stunned by the simple invitation. No expectation, no judgment, just room and warmth. He hesitated, then nodded slightly. "I'll be in soon, kid." Lila beamed and ducked back inside, leaving Colt and Clara alone once more. Clara gave him a small smile, not pushing him further. "Whenever you're ready," she said gently, and then she left him to his thoughts. Colt remained on the porch long after she'd gone in. The cold didn't bother him, not anymore, because for the first time in years, something else did. What if he was ready? What if he could stay? What if this storm had washed away more than snow? The sun finally broke over the ridgeline, casting the snowy world in golden light. Inside, laughter echoed through the cabin walls. Colt Mercer, outlaw, exile, ghost, stood quietly, staring at the cabin door. At the life inside, at the place where he wasn't yet part of, but wasn't locked out from either. And for the first time since he rode away from his past, he wondered if maybe he'd come home after all. By the time the sun fully claimed the sky, the world outside looked almost peaceful. Snow shimmered like crushed diamonds, soft and quiet beneath the pale blue above. But inside the cabin, life hummed louder than ever. Colt sat cross-legged on the floor, whittling a small block of wood as Jesse and Matthew watched closely. "Is that going to be a horse?" Jesse asked, eyes wide with curiosity. Maybe, Colt replied, giving them a rare slight smile. If my hands remember how. Lila sat nearby, her little face serious as she braided yarn into her doll's hair. Every so often she glanced over at Colt, as if to make sure he wasn't leaving. He noticed, and it tugged at him harder than he liked to admit. Clara worked quietly by the stove, but her eyes often drifted toward them, to Colt and her children, gathered in a way that felt natural, easy. Too easy, she thought, for a man who claimed he didn't belong anywhere. As the afternoon wore on, the warmth in the room wasn't just from the fire. It came from shared laughter, from soft voices, from the way the children leaned against Colt without hesitation. At one point, Lila climbed into his lap without asking, curling into his broad chest like she'd done it 100 times before. Colt froze, just for a second, then carefully rested his hand on her back, steady and gentle. Clara watched from across the room, her chest tightening in ways she hadn't expected. Later, when the children drifted into naps, full from stew and worn out from play, Clara finally spoke up. "You're good with them," she said softly. Colt shook his head, though his eyes lingered on the sleeping faces. "They don't know who I really am," he replied. "If they did—" "They know who you are now," Clara interrupted, her voice firmer than before. "And so do I." Colt met her gaze, the flickering firelight dancing in his tired, wary eyes. "I rode with bad men," he confessed quietly. "I stole, lied, worse. I didn't bury any of them, but I sure as hell didn't save them either." Clara didn't flinch. She didn't look away. She only stepped closer, lowering herself into the chair beside him. "Do you think you're the only soul carrying regrets?" she asked softly. "I buried a husband who didn't love me the way I needed. I dragged my children across states chasing a better life that never came. I've failed more times than I can count." Colt blinked, surprised by her honesty. "I'm no saint, Colt," she continued, "but I know a good man when I see one. You didn't have to help us. You didn't have to stay, but you did. And that's who you are now." For a long time he said nothing. Then quietly, almost like a man afraid to ask, "Then why does it feel easier to leave than to stay?" Clara's face softened. She reached out, resting her hand lightly over his, the same hand still holding the half-carved wooden horse. "Because staying means risking something," she said gently. Leaving's easy, no expectations, no chance of failing, but staying means you matter again. And that's the hardest thing of all." Her touch lingered, warm and steady. Colt didn't pull away. Instead, he stared at her hand on his, then at the sleeping children. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees. No longer angry, no longer wild, just soft, almost inviting. "What if I don't know how to stay?" Colt asked finally, his voice quieter than she'd ever heard. Clara smiled then, tender and knowing. "Then you start with one night," she replied softly. "And when the morning comes, you make the same choice again." He didn't answer with words, but when Lila stirred in her sleep and reached blindly for him, Colt shifted closer, pulling her gently against him and letting her head rest on his chest. Clara watched him, her heart full and uncertain all at once. Outside, the storm had passed, but inside, something had begun, something fragile, something hopeful, something that neither Colt Mercer nor Clara Monroe dared name just yet. Spring arrived quietly. No grand announcement, no fanfare. Just small, stubborn signs. The snow melted slowly, exposing tired earth and crooked fences. The river broke free from its icy prison, whispering through the valley like a long-lost friend. And in the cabin, laughter came easier than it had in months. Colt sat on the porch, whittling a tiny horse as Matthew and Jesse chased each other in the soft mud. Lila sat at his feet, humming softly as she braided wildflowers into a makeshift crown. Clara stepped out with 2 mugs of coffee, her face flushed from working in the small garden they'd started together. "Warmest day yet," she said, offering him a cup. Colt accepted it with a quiet nod, his eyes drifting out toward the valley. His jaw tightened, and Clara noticed. "You're thinking about going back, aren't you?" she asked gently. Colt didn't answer right away. Instead, he stared at the distant trail that led toward Dry Creek, the nearest town, a place he hadn't dared step foot in since he hung up his guns. "They still remember me," he said finally. "The posters, the stories. I ain't forgotten." Clara set her cup down and moved closer, her voice tender but steady. "Colt, they don't know you," she said softly. "Not like we do." He looked at her, something vulnerable flashing in his usually guarded eyes. "And if they don't care? If they still see Hollow Ridge's outlaw?" Clara's gaze didn't waver. "Then they're blind, because I see the man who carried my children through a blizzard. I see the man who stays up late, carving toys just to see them smile. I see the man who gives more than he thinks he has." Colt's throat worked as he swallowed hard. He couldn't remember the last time anyone had spoken to him like that. Not with pity, not with fear, with belief. Before he could reply, Lila tugged on his sleeve. "Are you leaving?" she asked softly, her big eyes shining with worry. Colt froze. I don't know yet, little one." Lila frowned. Then without hesitation, she stood and placed the crooked flower crown on his head. "You can't leave," she declared matter-of-factly. "You're our papa now." The word hit him like a bullet straight to the chest. But not the painful kind. The kind that shattered walls long thought unbreakable. Colt stared at the girl, speechless. Then Matthew chimed in from the yard, shouting across the breeze, "Yeah, Papa Colt, you can't leave us now." Jesse followed with a grin. "You belong here." Colt looked at Clara, unsure how to respond. But Clara only smiled softly, stepping closer, close enough that her voice was just for him. "They already decided," she whispered. "All you have to do is say yes." For a moment, Colt looked away, as if fighting something deep inside. But when he turned back, the decision was already there. Slow, certain. He removed his hat, letting the ridiculous flower crown sit proudly on his head, and let out a soft, almost broken laugh. "Guess I don't stand a chance against you lot," he said, shaking his head. Clara's smile widened, and for the first time, Colt reached for her hand openly, pulling her gently toward him. No words, no grand speeches, just acceptance. The sun sank low that evening as they all sat on the porch. A strange patchwork family stitched together by storm, survival, and something deeper. The valley no longer felt empty. The cabin no longer felt temporary. And for Colt Mercer, outlaw, loner, lost soul, the road didn't call anymore, because here, beneath the fading pink sky, and with small hands tugging at his sleeves and a woman resting easily beside him, he finally understood. Home wasn't something you found. It was something you let happen. Not every outlaw rides into the sunset, and not every widow stays lost forever. Sometimes the harshest storms don't break us. They reveal what matters most. Colt Mercer never imagined he'd become anything more than a ghost on the frontier. A man whispered about, avoided, and long forgotten by the world he once rode through with fire and fury. He accepted his exile, wore it like armor, and convinced himself he didn't deserve the warmth of others. Clara Monroe never thought she'd trust again. Her husband was gone, her dreams shattered. All she had left were 3 small hearts depending on her, and a world too cruel to offer kindness. But when the snow fell hardest, when the blizzard swallowed their hopes whole, fate didn't send angels or heroes. It sent him, rough, reluctant, and haunted. And somehow, that was exactly what they needed. Because in that storm, under the weight of silence, doubt, and survival, something unspoken began. A family wasn't formed in a church or signed on paper. It grew slowly in shared meals, quiet laughs, and hands reaching for each other in the dark. Now with the blizzard behind them and spring on the horizon, they face a new kind of journey. Not marked by miles or danger, but by the courage to believe they are worth loving and worth staying for. But what about you? Could you forgive the past? Could you trust a man like Colt Mercer if he stood on your porch, not asking for redemption, but simply a place to belong? Could you choose love, even if it came wearing scars instead of promises? Tell us below. We want to hear your story, your truth. Comment now and share your thoughts. Do you believe people like Colt can truly change? Can broken people become family again? And don't forget, Like if you felt this story deep in your heart. Comment and join the conversation about second chances and healing. Subscribe so you don't miss the next Wild West legend that proves even the hardest souls can find a home.